Topic 51B, the Vietnam War 1969 to 1975. You should take notes during this podcast, pause it as necessary, and listen to it as many times as you need to, as you'll need these notes to complete future graded assignments. I recommend that you take notes in the Cornell method of note-taking as presented in Podcast 3 of this course. By the end of this podcast, you should be able to analyze how the conduct of the Nixon administration in Vietnam further eroded public support for the war and confidence in the government itself, and identify reasons for and consequences of the American defeat in Vietnam. We ended the last podcast by noting that the Johnson administration's failure to foresee the Tet Offensive of 1968, as well as its denial of how poorly the military was achieving its aims in Vietnam, led to Johnson's choice to not run for re-election in 1968. Instead, power shifted that year to Republican Richard Nixon, who campaigned on a promise to achieve, quote, peace with honor, unquote, in Vietnam. His strategy to achieve this goal was called Vietnamization, or building up South Vietnamese ability to fight while withdrawing U.S. ground troops and increasing aerial bombings of the North. In addition, Nixon brought the fight outside Vietnam's borders as he bombed North Vietnamese supply lines along the famed Ho Chi Minh Trail in Cambodia. This move lent more support to the anti-war movement at home, as we'll hear about in a later podcast. Flagging American support for the war, as well as the failure of Vietnamization, led the Nixon administration to pursue peace talks in earnest in 1972. The Paris Peace Accords were signed and a ceasefire declared in 1973. But as President Nixon was forced to resign in the wake of the Watergate scandal, which we'll also learn about in a later podcast, and Congress curtailed funding to South Vietnam, the price of oil skyrocketed, leaving many of the tanks the South possessed unusable. The Viet Cong took advantage of these weaknesses and a dry season to recapture territory that the communists had lost in the South. By spring of 1975, the North advanced on to Saigon, the South's capital, which fell on April 30th. In the last moments before the fall, hundreds of remaining Americans, foreign nationals, and some South Vietnamese were evacuated via helicopter, an enduring symbol of America's first defeat in a foreign war. On July 2, 1976, North and South Vietnam formed the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. And though many worried that the North would kill thousands of Southerners, no such mass executions occurred. Nevertheless, many Southerners were forced to attend re-education camps, where they often suffered from starvation and hard labor. In neighboring Cambodia, the Communist Khmer Rouge Party took power on April 17, 1975, and leader Pol Pot oversaw the genocide of between 1 and 3 million Cambodians. Between 1975 and 1998, the United States welcomed over 1 million refugees from the war-torn region, though hundreds of thousands of these quote-unquote boat people died on boats trying to escape the poverty and persecution that awaited them in the wake of what the Vietnamese call the American War. Coming as it did in the wake of the Watergate scandal, Nixon resignation, and oil embargo, the defeat in Vietnam contributed to a deep malaise in American public life in the mid to late 1970s. News of war crimes committed by American soldiers, such as the massacre of innocent non-combatants at the village of My Lai, turned many Americans against the war and some against returning soldiers. Reports of widespread drug use by servicemen during the war also helped contribute to the public perception that the Vietnam War was a mission gone horribly awry. The coincidence of the war with the civil rights movement also led many to question draft policies that permitted college students to defer service, while their less educated and often lower income peers were sent off to the war. Morale among the troops fell for these reasons. Stateside, many young men dodged the draft by moving to Canada, while in Vietnam, many servicemen deserted or even attempted to kill unpopular officers to express their dissatisfaction with the war. In the years following 1975, many tried to understand the lessons of the Vietnam War and the reasons for American defeat. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger believed that our armed forces were ill-equipped to fight the guerrilla war being waged by the Viet Cong, while General Westmoreland admitted that the U.S.'s heavy reliance on bombing was insufficient to achieve victory. However, an underestimation of the enemy's commitment to their cause was likely foremost among the reasons for American defeat. Communist leader Ho Chi Minh had been quoted as saying, "You can kill 10 of my men for every one I kill of yours, but even at these odds, you will lose and I will win." Sadly, Ho's words were prophetic. 58,220 Americans and approximately 1 million Vietnamese on both sides died during the 20-year conflict. The casualties numbers grow if one considers those who returned from the war with post-traumatic stress, or those exposed to the millions of gallons of chemical defoliants sprayed by the U.S. Air Force to prevent the enemy from hiding weapons under the cover of leafy trees. Multiple types of cancer, as well as spina bifida, have been linked among children of those exposed to Agent Orange and other defoliants, yet the U.S. justice system has rejected attempts by the Vietnamese to bring suit against Dow Chemical and other U.S. manufacturers of these chemicals. Hundreds of American servicemen were taken prisoner during the war, and despite the 1973 Operation Homecoming, after which President Nixon announced the return of all POWs, 2,646 Americans remained prisoners or missing in action after 1973. Given reports of widespread torture of POWs by the North Vietnamese at prisoner camps, such as the infamous Hanoi Hilton, the fate of these unaccounted-for servicemen continued to haunt their families, some of whom founded the National League of Families of American Prisoners and Missing in Southeast Asia. And the American public was haunted through films such as Rambo in the 1980s. Several governmental commissions investigated the issue of POWs' MIAs during the 1980s and 90s, and by the end of the first decade of the 2000s, more than 700 American service members' remains had been returned from Vietnam, with whom President Bill Clinton had resumed trade on February 3, 1994, claiming that the, quote, best way to ensure cooperation from Vietnam and to continue getting the information Americans want on POWs and MIAs is to end the trade embargo, unquote. Critics denied this motive, claiming that Clinton's policy was designed to make money. As of March 23, 2016, 1,621 Americans remained unaccounted for in Southeast Asia, site of America's longest war. Please take a moment to review the learning objectives for this podcast. Write each one out in a sentence or a paragraph now. If you find that you can't do so, Go back to the beginning of the podcast, listen and watch again, and pause it as necessary to supplement the notes you've already taken until you can easily answer all of these learning objectives. In the next podcast, we'll learn about the anti-war movement that protested the war in Vietnam and helped bring it to a close.